Hi, I'm Lisa Spooner, and you're watching the lesson Types of Attacks, which is part of the CompTIA Security Plus training course. As an IT security professional, you'll need to know what kind of attacks are out there. You'll need to know what you're up against. So this lesson introduces you to a number of common assaults that you'll need to recognize and maybe even do battle against out in the field. Things like attacks on your data while it's being transmitted. Those are spoofing attacks, farming, man-in-the-middle, replay attacks, denial of service and distributed denial of service, something called a Smurf attack, and then the use of network scanners and sniffers by unauthorized individuals to find vulnerabilities in your organization. Then we have attacks that come by way of email. Those are spam. We all know about spam, right? But we're going to talk about just how dangerous and costly spam can be. And then phishing with a PH. You can see that phishing has a PH, farming has a PH. That's just a common naming convention for cyber attacks. And lastly, some other attacks we'll discuss are privilege escalation, transitive access, and client-side attacks. So the test objective that we're going to cover in this lesson is analyze and differentiate among types of attacks. Let's do just that. And we'll start with those attacks on data in transit. And the first of those attacks that we're going to discuss is spoofing. Spoofing is lying, pretending, masquerading, making data appear to have come from somewhere that it didn't, or to be something that it isn't. And there's lots of things that can be spoofed. We've got IP spoofing, and that's where the source address for IP packets are spoofed to appear to have come from a trusted host, or any host really that isn't the attacker's. Then ARP spoofing, or sometimes called ARP poisoning or ARP cache poisoning. ARP, that's Address Resolution Protocol. And when an attacker does ARP spoofing, the MAC address for the attacker's machine is changed to look like it came from a different network. And actually, if the attacker spoofs his MAC to look like the default gateway, then any traffic meant for that gateway will now go to the attacker instead. So you can see the possibilities for harm here. But one little bit of solace, if the attacker wanted to do ARP spoofing, they would need to know a valid internal address first, something to use to spoof. They would need to know that default gateway's address. And then DNS spoofing, domain name system spoofing, is where the DNS info is faked and then users are sent to the wrong website or email is rerouted to the wrong place. I've got an example of spoofing here. An attacker changes the MAC address of his wireless card to look like it's from a valid internal machine and then uses that to gain access. So which kind of spoofing is that? ARP, right? So that's spoofing or poisoning. Next up, farming, which is taking traffic intended for one destination and redirecting it to another. Now, if you think that sounds a lot like DNS spoofing, that's because DNS spoofing is one method for farming on a large scale. Or more locally, the attacker can perform farming by just changing the host file on the victim's computer. So the attacker has you redirected, they have you in the palm of their hands. What do they want from you? Well, the bogus farming site often looks nearly identical to the legitimate site. So that would trick you into entering your personal data like your username or password. And that's the example that I have down here. The site looks fine, you enter your info, but you receive like a login error saying your password is invalid. And even though you've entered it correctly, this bogus site can't authenticate you and let you in. They don't actually have the right database. So they send you that error, but they're actually keeping and storing that login information, and then they go behind your back and log into the real site as you and wreak all sorts of havoc. But the attacker doesn't have to redirect you to a lookalike site. Farming is just any unauthorized redirection. So they could be, say, stealing traffic from a competitor to get your business. It can be anything really, like something for sale, maybe a fake alert about a virus prompting you to download something to fix it. Okay, so a little trick to remembering farming is think livestock herding. Herding, farming, get it? The traffic is being herded over to the bogus site. Now, a man-in-the-middle attack is where two parties think they are communicating with each other, but the attacker is actually between the two, intercepting and controlling the communication. And neither of the two nodes know that this is happening. And this is an active attack. The attacker could be just eavesdropping, or could be altering or redirecting the data. They really have full control. Some mitigation techniques for man-in-the-middle are use strong, really strong mutual authentication, public key infrastructure, and one-time pads. Now, if you don't know what one of those three are, that's fine. Don't worry, we'll get there. Now, it's easier to explain man-in-the-middle attack with a diagram. So what we have here is client A wants to be communicating with server B. Simple enough. And this is what they think is happening, that they're directly communicating with each other. But instead, there's that man in the middle. So how it works when a man-in-the-middle attack is taking place, client A initiates a session with client B, or at least they think so. C intercepts it, pretending to be B. Then C actually starts that session with B, but B thinks it's A. So now B is communicating with C, and C is communicating with A, and the whole time the man in the middle is controlling that communication. Next is replay attacks. That's when an attacker captures information during transmission and then resends it later. So if we go back to our man in the middle example, A wants to start a session with B, tries to authenticate by sending its username and password. C, there's that man in the middle, grabs that username and password, saves a copy, but also sends it on to B so that they can start their session. A and B have their session and they never know that that username and password was grabbed. Now later, after the session's over, C can replay that username and password information to B, starting a new session pretending to be A. That's when the replay attack occurs. So here's that example I just showed you. The attacker obtains a copy of the logon information and uses again later to access the system. Some mitigation for replay attacks: use one-time use session tokens. So after that session ends, the replay attacker can't use that same session because it was one-time use. Or lower the clock synchronization tolerance. So this would be if A and B started their session and later the man in the middle tried to continue the session, they couldn't because too much time has passed. They would have timed out. But one downfall of lowering the clock synchronization tolerance is that maybe A and B during their normal, legitimate transaction, they take too long to get back to each other. That clock synchronization tolerance could time out and they'll have to re-authenticate. So it's really up to you to find that sweet spot between annoyance and security. Next, denial of service. That's big D, little O, big S. Now, unlike some of the more strangely named attacks like farming or Smurf, denial of service is exactly what the title says. It aims to deny legitimate users access to services. And it does this by overloading the resources with really large amounts of data. So a denial of service attack aims to deny access to resources or information, or actually crash a whole website or operating system. And a denial of service attack works by occupying all the available bandwidth or all of the available computing power so that the legitimate requests cannot get through. Some symptoms of a denial of service attack: unusually slow network performance or a website that's down. And some mitigation techniques, well, actually, I put just a little because there's not a whole lot you can do against a sophisticated denial of service attack. You can always keep up with patch management, have a well-configured firewall coupled with an intrusion prevention system, but this is only going to protect you against really simple denial of service attacks and will not help much against sophisticated denial of service attacks. Got another nifty diagram for you here. The first thing I'm going to show you is a type of denial of service attack called a ping of death, and that is where the attacker sends lots and lots and lots of pings to the victim asking for acknowledgement. And the victim can't possibly respond to all of those pings, so it gets overloaded and good traffic can't get through. Next, buffer overflow, and that's when the attacker actually sends too large of data, maybe a string that's too large, to the victim, overflowing the buffer, and again, the good traffic can't get through. And there's also something called a TCP SYN flooding attack, and that's when you start too many TCP sessions for the victim to handle. Now there's also something called a distributed denial of service attack. This ramps it up. It uses multiple systems to magnify the intensity of the denial of service attack. So the attacker uses a master system that coordinates third-party zombie nodes to participate in the denial of service attack. Now, these zombies normally don't know that their resources are being used for this. The controlling program probably came onto the host as malware and might just make itself disappear as quietly as it came in, or it might actually gunk up the zombies and crash them afterwards to destroy the evidence. This whole setup here with a master controlling remote hosts is sometimes called a botnet, with the compromised hosts being referred to as bots. But as you will see in the malware lesson, botnets are usually used for sending large amounts of spam instead of denial of service attacks. Now, a Smurf attack actually combines some of the concepts that we've been talking about so far. With a Smurf, the attacker spoofs, remember spoofing, ICMP packets to make it look like they came from one particular host, and that one host ends up being the target for the attack. ICMP packets aren't really used for data transmissions, but more for controlling messages, so things like error messages or pings, and that's exactly what the attacker does. They broadcast a ping to a group of different hosts on a network. They all reply to that target, overloading it and possibly overloading the network traffic along the way. As you can see in this diagram, the attacker sends one ping request to each host, all on a network, and these hosts all reply to the target because they think the ping request came from the target. So each host sends a reply to the target, overloading it with ping replies that it didn't actually request. And that's when that denial of service happens because the target can't handle all those ping replies. I also want to warn you about scanners and sniffers. So here we've got a network scanner or network sniffer, and this is a tool that captures and displays network traffic. But for an attacker to use this tool, they must have some kind of internal access. So that could be sitting at an internal client with its network interface card set to promiscuous mode, or just like in the Hollywood movies, the attacker could attach a portable device in an unlocked wiring closet or in an unattended server room. So that's why strong physical security and well-written security policies and employee education about those policies is so important. That way no outside person can gain unchaperoned internal access and then use one of these network scanners on your organization. There are also port scanners or port sniffers, and this is a tool that systematically queries ports to see which ones are open. And this time the attacker doesn't need to be inside to use this tool. If they are external, all they can scan really is the internet-facing machines like the web servers or the Exchange Edge transport server. So it is extremely important that those particular machines be all patched up and maintain the highest level of system hardening possible. But if an attacker gains even just one internal IP address, then they can probe all the addresses in the range to try to gain a better idea of the internal structure of the network. So the bottom line is, if somebody uses a port scanner on your organization, you want them to find as little open as possible. So make sure all of your routers are properly configured, you've got well-configured firewalls, and every system has gone through extensive hardening. But be warned, there is something called an Xmas scan, and this is an advanced technique that can even get around some less advanced firewalls. And it's called an Xmas scan or a Christmas scan, because in this case, all of the packets that are sent to the firewall have all of the options turned on for any protocol. So it's said that they're lit up like a Christmas tree. Scary stuff. And all of these types of tools, scanners, sniffers, enumerators, mappers, they can all be used as tools for good instead of evil. So you're going to want to scan and sniff your own network before the attacker does. And we will be talking more about these tools later and how to use them to find and close vulnerabilities. But one example would be the Smurf attack that we just talked about. So if you had a network scanner set up on your own network, you could see the unusually large amount of ICMP ping replies going across your network, and you would know that a Smurf attack has taken place. Next up, attacks via email and other communications. First up, and something I'm sure you see a lot, is spam. Spam is any unwanted or unsolicited communication, and it's sent in bulk. Now, normally when we talk about spam or we think about email, right? But really, like I said, it's any unsolicited communication that's sent in bulk. So there's something here called SPIM, that's spam over instant messenger. And really, spam can be anywhere. It can be in the forums, in online news groups, sent as text messages to your cell phone, everywhere. And those spam messages can contain malware or links to sites infected with malware. Spam ranges from obvious nonsense to some quite convincing messages. I would hope by now that you all know what obvious spam looks like, right? It's that paragraph of text, maybe with really poor grammar or even complete nonsense text that's a bunch of real words that are put together in not quite coherent sentences. And then this text is coupled with a link promising cheap medications or counterfeit goods. I know you know that that's obvious spam. Most people do. But can everyone in your organization spot the more sophisticated spam, the ones where phishing and spoofing techniques are used? If not, your organization might need some user education about spam and some clear email policies like do not interact with any unsolicited email, even to unsubscribe. Another spam mitigation technique is using an anti-spam filter. And when I say anti-spam filter, that's kind of a wide-reaching term that encompasses many things. It can be a blacklist or a block list that's built into your email service. So it could be built into your Microsoft Exchange server or whatever other email provider you're using. Or a spam filter can be a behavior-based filter that learns what you delete without opening and then starts putting those types of messages into your spam folder. Now, when we start talking about spam filters and user education, we start to get into the real cost of spam. I know that dealing with spam messages is kind of a part of our everyday life, so we don't really think about the cost, but really, it costs companies productivity, and it costs them money for those anti-spam services. And there are a number of nifty spam calculators online that can help you to figure out what that cost is. Let me show you one. This one here is asking, how much does spam cost your enterprise? And with some numbers that were already pre-populated when I got to the website, a company with 1,500 employees that make an average of $50,000 a year each, they get about 60 messages a day, and 40% of those messages are spam. With those numbers, spam costs this company over $400,000 a year just in lost productivity. And if people are actually responding to even just 1% of those emails, it costs the company another $263,000 a year. Then there's the cost of storing all that extra email, that's spam, for a grand total of over $800,000 a year. Spam's not cheap. And heading back to the slides, it's really sad that by forcing everyone else to suffer the burden of the cost, these spammers really reduce the benefit of email to everyone. Now, as a response to this, the US government has actually passed some largely ignored legislation. It's called the CAN-SPAM Act of 2003, and it requires that any bulk email follows a set of criteria, like it includes the actual physical address of where the company resides that's sending the email. It has a relevant subject line, tells you exactly what the email is going to be about, and has a link or an option for how to opt out and stop receiving those emails, which in itself can actually be a trick. Remember we said don't interact with any unsolicited email? So if you click that remove me button, you're actually responding to the email. You're telling the spammer, I am a real person. I am opening and reading your spam emails. Please send me more. And the last thing we need is more spam. Now, I just mentioned phishing is being used in more sophisticated spam attacks. Now let me elaborate. Actually, you might have seen this before, but might not have known the name. Phishing is trying to get a person to disclose their personal information by pretending to be something that they trust. Maybe a trusted person, a trusted company, or even a website that they go to often. So they're phishing, right? They're sending up a bait, and they're hoping that you bite by responding with that personal information. And those phishing messages often come as spam emails, And to try to look even more legitimate, they will use the logo or the color schemes of whatever entity they're trying to mimic. So if the message is supposed to look like it came from a particular bank, then the email would have that bank's logo in the corner or the header at the top. And oftentimes a phishing email tries to create a sense of urgency or fear. They pose as a security team or a customer service rep, and they need that information from you right away. An example would be, "Dear customer, we have experienced data loss. Please respond with your account number and password so we can rebuild our database. You must do this or you will lose access to your account." Okay, that was a really bad example, and it's a really good thing that I don't make a living writing phishing emails, but the point is, a common technique is to make the mail look like it came from an authority and then add that sense of urgency to respond with the request. Now, actually, this phishing email might not ask you to hit reply and respond to the email directly, but instead it prompts you to click on a link that's in the email that takes you to a spoofed website that will ask for that personal information there. It's just another layer to try to look more legitimate. And this is easier than that DNS poisoning we were talking about. In this case, the attacker doesn't need to redirect any traffic to get people to that fake website because you were actually tricked into going there directly from the link inside the email. What is even more tricky is spear phishing, which is using some specific information about the target of the email. If you receive an email from a bank that you don't even belong to, you are less likely to respond than if it's from your bank, and maybe even the exact local branch that you actually have an account with. Getting away from the banking scenario, spear phishing could refer to real people's names, like the recipient's full name, or their nickname, or a name of a family member. Anything to try to seem more familiar. Then there's whaling, which is spear phishing targeted at high-level employees or people with high-level access. That could be you as the IT security professional. You have the door code to the server room. You know the administrator credentials. So the attacker could try out whaling on you. So be sure to double, triple check any requests for classified information and make sure your other whales do the same. There is also vishing, which is phishing over VoIP. So now you're getting a phone call instead of an email. Phishing uses the anonymity that VoIP offers. It can get past the caller ID and be hard to trace. The main mitigation techniques for all these kinds of phishing are just like for spam. User education, that's don't respond and don't click on links in emails unless you know for sure who the request is coming from and that person is allowed access to the requested info. Also employ a spam filter that offers phishing protection. And a little trick that I use, if a message looks fishy, Google it. Chances are that the sender's email address or the exact text in the message is already associated with a known phishing scheme, and it's out there if you just take the time to go look for it. And the last section, other attacks. Here we've got privilege escalation, which is the ability of someone or some application to gain privileges or access that they are not supposed to have. This could be caused by a configuration oversight. Perhaps the administrator created a guest account for someone, but accidentally put that account into the admin group. Configuration oversight happens, but more commonly, privilege escalation happens as a result of a backdoor that is left in a program. This backdoor might have been just for debugging purposes while the program was in development and the developers forgot to close it, or the developers could have purposely written in a backdoor. For either of those two causes, privilege escalation might be used by an outside attacker, or it could be an honest employee that just happened to cross the vulnerability by chance, could be harmless. But most scary is an insider that's using privilege escalation with malicious intent. Maybe they want the access to the payroll information for other employees, or they want to find and sell company secrets to the competition. How do we find or prevent privilege escalation? Well, for the configuration oversight, we use account auditing to review who has access to what, and we use the principle of least privilege when creating and managing accounts. That's only give a user access to what they need to do their job, no more. And if your company has contracted someone to write you a custom application, be sure to perform a code review. Briefly, that's look for holes in the code and look for any changes that that application makes to your current system once it's installed. Next up, transitive access. This is when trust is transferred from one party that you've given that trust to onto a third party that you may not know and trust. And this normally refers to Windows Server Active Directory forests. So if you take a look at this diagram here, let's say your company owns Forest A, and you've established a trust relationship with Forest B from another company. But what happens if B then establishes a trust relationship with C, and A might not know anything about it? And depending on how this is set up, C may now have what's called a transitive trust relationship with A, and then C could have access to anything on A that B does. That's transitive access. Some examples of when this might happen: when you're entering into a joint venture with another company, or you've hired consultants that need domain access. One way to control this is to make sure that all trust relationships are validated. And if you do need to establish trust, don't give access to your entire forest unless it's necessary. Instead, create a separate forest with just the resources you want to share. And the last type of attack we'll go over in this lesson is client-side attacks. This takes advantage of the client-server relationship, and it happens when a client interacts with a server that is normally trustworthy but has since been compromised. This could be an FTP server, a file server, email server, web server, etc. For example, say a user uses an FTP client to log on to the compromised FTP server and download a file. Well, they actually get malicious code instead of, or as well as, what they thought they were downloading. And this malicious code allows the attacker to execute programs on the now infected client machine. And these programs will run at the permission level of whatever user is logged in at the time. So you can imagine if it's an admin that's logged in, that's a lot worse than just a regular user. It's important to know that just having that client program installed on your machine does not automatically mean you're going to get the malicious code. Because without launching the client application, you don't actually run the risk of processing any harmful data that gets sent from the server. For the attack to take place, you actually need to interact with that compromised server. So if we go back to the FTP example, you would actually need to open up that FTP program, authenticate with the server, and start to download something before you get that bad code. Now, a well-configured firewall isn't going to do much help because the very act of using a client application to connect to what you think is a trusted server is something that the firewall would and should allow. However, using an advanced intrusion prevention system might catch this incoming bad code. And here I've got for you 4 slides that are full with all the terminology that was introduced in this lesson. Please go back over any you may have questions on because these terms do map directly to the exam objectives. And there are a few I want to talk a little more about, like Xmas scan. Now this is something that isn't necessary for the exam, but is really interesting. These are the 3 flags that are set to on that help those Christmas tree packets get past the firewall. And don't forget about spam. This one didn't have its own slide. Remember that spam over instant messenger. And don't forget all the different types of phishing. And I do want to talk about malicious insider threats a little bit more. We brought this up when discussing privilege escalation, but a malicious insider can use any type of dishonest behavior because they're an employee that has malevolent intent against his or her company. So this person could be angry with the company or be looking for monetary gain. So just remember, a malicious insider is someone that works for the company but may also be working for themselves. All right, in this lesson we covered several different types of attacks, and we started off with attacks on data in transit. First up is spoofing. That's faking or masquerading. And you can fake anything from a whole website down to itty-bitty tiny little packets. Then farming, which is redirecting traffic and can involve spoofing. Watch out for that man in the middle that is eavesdropping on and controlling data transmissions. That man in the middle can also reuse what they intercept and replay it later to perform a replay attack. Be sure to check your log files if you suspect that this is happening. There is denial of service and distributed denial of service that aims to deny service to legitimate people and processes, but the distributed version uses other hosts to make the attack more powerful. We've got Smurf attacks that rely on the ICMP ping reply process, and I would suggest disallowing all ICMP packets altogether if you don't explicitly need them in your environment. We talked about scanners and sniffers that look for open ports and maybe even get access to the internal network traffic. The two communication attacks that we discussed are that annoying and costly spam, and then phishing, which is using spam or other means to try to bait people into giving away information that they shouldn't. Some other attacks we discussed were privilege escalation, which is using a backdoor or a misconfiguration to gain higher access than one should have. Transitive access exploits established trusts to transfer that trust onto a third party. And last, client-side attacks, which take advantage of the client-server relationship to get malicious code off the server and onto the client. And thanks for watching this lesson on types of attacks.